It's become a self-fulfilling prophecy, the special relationship. We've deluded ourselves, it has sometimes flattered our vanity, but is often, I would say, something closer to a strategic enemy than a friend.
And I think that Rob's decision, does make sense. Hello and welcome to Quite Right. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer at The Spectator.
And this week we'll be talking about Trump and the special relationship. Is it now the case that the big orange man has behaved in such a provocative fashion that we have to fundamentally reassess Britain's relationship with America? And also, the latest reform defections, Andrew Rossendale, Rob Jenrick, and perhaps a mystery man or woman from Labour. What does that tell us about the state of British politics and the viability of a Conservative alternative to Keir Starmer? Well, this week, Maddie, it's been, in the words of Christopher Hill, the world turned upside down, because we've had, over the course of the last 7 days, the most significant defection of a Conservative to reform with Robert Jenrick. But what we've also had is a backdrop in which some of the assumptions of Conservatives in the UK have been challenged as never before when it comes to the transatlantic relationship. Mm-hmm. Because Donald Trump's words and actions in connection with Greenland have, I think, united most people in Britain against him. But it had been the case, I think, that there was, at the very least, a sneaking regard for Trump's ability to get things done, for his resolute action on migration, the borders, and deportation, tough line on crime, his anti-woke position, and a certain sort of straightforward decisionism on his part. But both the substance and the style of what he's been doing on Greenland has, I think, turned a significant number of people who might even have entertained a small amount of affection for him into critics and outright opponents.
The polling suggests that if you're like a Reform voter or a Conservative voter, you're against it. I think the Conservative voters are more against it than the Reform voters. But Trump is extremely unpopular in Britain and has become more unpopular still with his actions over the last week. And I think that it's something that the right will have to come out and disavow publicly, or it could even be a problem. We've already seen how the Canadian elections were basically ruined for the Conservatives there due to Trump's outbursts and his actions on tariffs. Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservatives, was seen as too Trump-aligned, and this was absolutely integral in explaining how Mark Carney was able to get in there and sweep through. But I personally think that the British right has got the special relationship wrong for some time and has assumed that we had an ally that always had our best interests at heart. And I don't think that that is the case. It was so interesting, wasn't it, a few months ago, how many people were absolutely convinced that Donald Trump was going to block the Chagos deal, which is clearly not in Britain's interest. And in the end, he came out and supported it. He's now, by the way, saying that the Chagos deal was always a terrible idea, despite having backed it. My hunch is that he was willing to back up Keir Starmer on that, provided Keir Starmer had his back on what he was going to do. And now that Keir Starmer has, I think, rightly spoken out against the designs on Greenland, Trump has decided to humiliate Starmer by withdrawing his support for Chagos.
Yes, so there seems to be an impulsivity about Trump's actions that it makes it difficult for even the most determined defender of him to weave into a coherent worldview or a coherent diplomatic and political strategy. Because on the one hand, until very recently, Trump had either acquiesced in or indeed actively approved of the Chagos deal. That had been the government's defense. Yes. This is an Anglo-American base. The Americans are happy with it and our other allies are happy with it. So why is that problematic? And Nigel Farage has welcomed Trump's intervention on the Chagos Islands and said, good for him. This only reaffirms how foolish Keir Starmer has been. But even as Nigel Farage applauds Trump for that, and indeed I suspect many of our listeners and readers will either welcome the intervention or say, serves you right to Starmer. Nevertheless, at the same time, Trump appears to have been provoked by the fact that there is a single British soldier, our Danish military attaché, in Greenland. And he seems to have regarded this as a provocation also which led him to write to the Norwegian Prime Minister saying, I didn't get the Peace Prize, therefore I'm no longer the Nobel Peace Prize. That is. Therefore, I'm no longer interested in peace. Out of the way, Viking. Greenland is mine.
Yes.
And
which is crazy because it's a decision taken by a Norwegian institution that has nothing to do with the Norwegian government, let alone the Danish government. So it seems quite an interesting repository for his unhappiness.
Quite. It's more like being a courtier with Henry VIII as monarch, in which you are trying, for example, to develop a thesis behind the Reformation and why the break with Rome is right, and then you discover that it's actually got far more to do with his libido, Henry VIII's, that is, not Trump's, than it has to do with
Martin Luther.
Yes.
Who would you say we are in the Tudor court? Wolsey, we've been trying very hard to placate, but we're going to get shafted.
Yes, well, arguably, Britain has been Thomas Cromwell, in that arguably Britain has been in a position where we've sought to explain and advance American interests, while not necessarily having affection for the king, certainly having a lingering respect for, and then now finding that the situation has altered. But I think that you're right in what you said earlier about a possible sort of difference. I don't know if it's generational or one of attitude, but I think for people of my generation, not quite old enough to be a boomer.
Definitely not.
But for people of my generation, there's a sort of romantic attachment to the Atlantic Alliance because of the memory of Reagan and Thatcher in the Cold War.
Yes.
And there is also a belief that, as a result still, you want to give America and its president the benefit of the doubt, though that becomes more difficult. And similarly, as I alluded to earlier, in some areas of domestic policy, some of the things that Trump has done may have been brutal and coarse, but they have shown that executive power can achieve real change, and so therefore can restore a degree of faith in the capacity of government.
You can just do things, as the saying goes.
To make a difference. But I think that, one of the challenges for people broadly of my generation is that some of them will have been very attached, of course, to the Atlantic Alliance, but to the Atlantic Alliance as a symbol or as the strongest manifestation of a particular type of multilateral international order. And now, with that order having been in decay for some time and Trump having essentially trampled over its grave, they are now looking elsewhere. But I think that your position is different. It's not that you were ever attached to the rules-based order. It's just that you thought that America, as a sovereign country, notwithstanding a shared language, doesn't have shared interests with the UK.
No, I think that Henry Kissinger is always our crucial window into understanding the American position. And, his famous phrase about America having no real friends or allies, only interests. Another great Kissinger quote is that to be enemies... Sorry, I'm going to paraphrase this because I'm probably misquoting, but to be America's enemy is dangerous, but to be its friend is, even more so. I do think that it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy, the special relationship. We've deluded ourselves. It has sometimes flattered our vanity. The British press pack and British politicians really enjoy getting to go to Washington, see the Oval Office, Rose Garden, you name it. And there was that particular nadir of this during the Blair years, where there were a lot of people that had OD'd on the West Wing, and it really flattered their ego. Yes. But the trouble is that in believing that myth, that is what has led us into the supplicant position we are now, where we actually can't stand on our own 2 feet. I think that if we had taken a more pragmatic, realistic view of things, for example, we wouldn't have ended up in a position where we don't really truly have an independent nuclear deterrent, that we're reliant on American support for aspects of the infrastructure in our nuclear capacity, for example. France did not make that mistake. I think we should have taken a more kind of Gaullist position that looked more closely at our own interests. But I think if you take a holistic look at the history of the 20th century, you find a country that is sometimes has a shared interest and we can sometimes collaborate with, but is often, I would say, something closer to a strategic enemy than a friend. The Suez, the fact that the American Navy was ready to actually fire on the British Navy during the Suez crisis, the fact that Margaret Thatcher was not consulted about Grenada, the fact that the US Secretary of State was minded to support Argentina in the Falklands conflict. These things are all very important, but we tend to focus more on World War II, for example, but not on how we were shafted by Lend-Lease after World War II, and we received debt repayment terms that were probably closer to what you'd expect from a defeated party that had not been on the side of moral good, that had been on the Axis power side.
Yes,
John Maynard Keynes was absolutely disgusted by the repayment terms that we got given. So I think it's partly our sort of slightly like Captain Tom nostalgia view of World War II and not what came after it.
I think that is a very fair, it's not even historical revisionism. I think that's a very, very historical account. And indeed, there's a great book that has just come out about the Second World War by the historian Tim Bouverie, which looks at the relationship between Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. And of course, Churchill saw Roosevelt and America as Britain's savior in the Second World War. And there's a marvelous scene where Randolph Churchill, Winston's son, comes in and Churchill is shaving, and Churchill says, "I've got it. I know how we will win. I will bring America in." But what Tim Bouverie brings out in his book is that actually Roosevelt was as close to Stalin as he was to Churchill in the intrigue. And he saw the Second World War both as a war, obviously, against Nazism and against Japanese militarism, but also a war that would see the end of empires and the end of the British Empire.
And destroying British hegemony was the clear objective of American foreign policy after the war too, which is fair enough. They wanted to be the number one global power. They had the national interests of their country at heart. But this is back to my point about delusion. We should also have our national interests at heart. And thinking we could rely on America led us into where we are now. And we're now in such a weak position that probably being America's lapdog is our best approach. And that's such a heartbreaking position to find ourselves in. And, I blame the political class of the last 70 years.
Some people, and not necessarily people who are on the progressive left, some people who would be trad one nation Tories, Heseltinians, would say, well, Maddie, thank you very much for accepting. And I think if Ted Heath were here, he would also join this chorus and say, you should always have realised that Britain's future lies with our European allies. What folly that you and your friends allowed yourself to be seduced by the Brexiteers. If he were here, what would you say to the ghost of Ted Heath?
So many things. I think that the European Union was not exactly a great friend of Britain either. It's pretty mental that we weren't allowed to join in 1957, that de Gaulle blocked it. That was always a Franco-German project. And I would have definitely wanted to stay in the EU if it hadn't gone in the direction post-Maastricht of ever closer union, taking national decisions increasingly into the hands of the bureaucrats. So, I would argue that that's a false dichotomy. You don't have to be, you can collaborate on shared areas of interest. In fact, as Britain has done on foreign policy since our departure from the EU, without necessarily surrendering so much to domestic decision making.
Yeah. No, I was teasing unfairly.
There's so many things we could say to the ghost of Ted Heath.
There are.
Can I tell you a really good Ted Heath story just very quickly? My husband and I know a guy who was the organ scholar at Balliol College, Oxford, which Ted Heath, I think, was also the organ scholar at Balliol. And this was maybe 20 years ago. So Ted Heath lived to a ripe old age. He was an elderly man at this point. And he'd come to visit the college and he just wanted to go to see his old room. So this chap was sitting in his room and he gets a knock on the door from like a college porter or something saying, by the way, Ted Heath wants to look in your room now. He'll be here in like 5-10 minutes. So it's this quick mad scramble trying to tidy up the room. And then Ted Heath walks into the room and says, oh yes, this used to be my room. And then he just says to this guy, and do you also piss in the sink?
That is a revealing metaphor for what Ted Heath did to the Conservative Party, as well as to his room in Balliol. May his memory be a blessing. The broader point, I think, is that I do, on this, agree with you. And you mentioned Kissinger earlier in the Palmerston view, that Britain has no permanent allies, only permanent interests. Obviously applied during the 19th century, at different times. It was either the Habsburgs or Germany or France that was supposed to be our natural ally. The truth was that Britain was better able to determine what was in its interests through safeguarding its own economic strength and being careful about the the loss of blood or treasure other than in defense of its own interests and its own citizens. And I know that seems antique, but actually it's an enduring truth. And that's why I think that you don't win the approval of other nations in international relations by operating in the same way as you would as an individual in civilized society, by being fair, generous, open-hearted, charitable, and a good Christian. You, in international relations, unfortunately, are operating in a jungle, and what success depends on is strength and nimbleness.
Yes.
And you win friends and allies for whatever purpose you're engaged on through that, which takes us back to your earlier point about the importance of looking to the economic resilience and the confidence of a country in the way that de Gaulle sought to do with France.
And also looking at who are actually our truest friends, because one thing that slightly irks me about the special relationship is that politicians say it because they almost manifest, they want to manifest, as the Gen Zs would say, that, you know, we will, just by talking about how special it is, I will make it more so. But in the process, like, we're ignoring who are actually our truest friends. I think it's quite clear to me that our truest friends are Canada, New Zealand, Australia. They've always had our back, and it didn't come with strings attached. During the Second World War, Canada just takes out a massive, they call it a loan. It's just a gift. We don't pay it back to help fight Nazism. Compare that to the American conduct after the Second World War. I think there is a lack of, I mean, maybe it's an old-fashioned idea, but a lack of honour. What Donald Trump is doing towards Denmark shows a complete dishonour and a treachery, given what the Danes did for America when they invoked Article 5 during the Middle Eastern wars in the noughties. The second highest casualty rate after America of any NATO country. And does it matter? Not at all. There's an idea called Kanzuk, the idea of some kind of greater alignment between those countries, including there's even been discussion of some kind of free movement area, not just free trade. Has this idea perhaps been a bit neglected by the political class because we've been too busy gazing across the Atlantic towards America?
I mean, I think the important thing to do is for Britain to retain that flexibility and to retain good relations while always looking to its own interests. I remember that the late Alan Clark said to me when I asked him, "What's your philosophy of foreign policy?" He said, Britain should remain on the balls of its feet. And what he meant by that is poised, almost like a boxer, ready to be flexible, to...
Palmerston style.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So
it's a very good phrase.
I wouldn't necessarily, myself, seek to create new formal...
entanglements
with secretariats and protocols and so on. I would concentrate on that. The other thing also is that there are lots of people within the Republican Party who indeed have a lot of sympathy with aspects of what Trump has done, that are worried about what he's been doing in Greenland, and who might, for example, sympathise with what he says about on the Chagos Islands.
Yeah.
But not elsewhere.
Why don't they ever seem to be able to stop him, rein him in? The British right is completely united on Chagos, and frankly, much of the British left, it's difficult for them to say so publicly, but they know it's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea that there is no argument for it, none whatsoever, other than Starmer's dodgy lawyer mate said so, and the Conservatives unwisely and almost by accident opened these negotiations that were then not concluded. Those are the two arguments. There are no other arguments. They know this. Why did none of those many overtures that will have been made? Why did none of that cause Trump to listen to us? To me, it's a great example of how it's all hot air and bluster, this so-called special relationship, and we see it in its own way flare up during whether it's a Republican in charge or a Democrat. But one of the crazy aspects of Trump's remarks on Greenland is that it seems actually more likely than anything else to send the West more in the direction of China, which would be a truly appalling outcome.
Well, Trump's stated, and Trump's allies stated, justification or rationale for Greenland is to ensure that there's a territorial integrity to the Golden Dome, the missile defense system for America, and also that Russia and China, as a result of the opening up of the High North, menace not just America's but the West's greater security. I think both those things are objectively true. That doesn't justify Trump's tactics, but they are objectively true. And the other thing is that even though he may not seem that constrained at the moment, there are still institutional bulwarks in America, and there are still orientations within America that will mean that fundamentally, notwithstanding the importance of looking to our own security, America will be more aligned over time with our interests and our values, politically and in defense terms, obviously, than others. And in particular, the desire that some have to orient away from America long term, exactly as you say, risks emboldening, in particular, China, and Chinese intentions towards its near abroad, but also towards British interests, are malign. And that's why the decision to say yes to Chinese plans for a super embassy in Tower Hamlets have to be seen in that context, both China's ambition, but also Britain's relative weakness. There's another factor as well, which is that the Foreign Office, as an institution, want this deal to go ahead, partly because, they prefer to have good relations with everyone, but also partly because they want the British embassy in Beijing to be granted permission to be remodeled and refurbished. This is not just because they want to ensure that our ambassador has a plusher sofa and a nicer garden. It's also because they want to have this sort of secure area within the embassy in which conversations can take place without surveillance enlarged.
How did they know they would be able to achieve that?
I think that conversations...
Is it not the case that anyone diplomatic or otherwise who goes to China is liable to be bugged, tapped, followed,
totally.
Have people enter their accommodation and move stuff around, etc.?
Yes, but there is a part of the British embassy in Beijing where one is assured that conversations can take place that cannot be eavesdropped
Assured
on.
by whom?
Well, by those whose job it is to ensure that conversations can be had discreetly. So I've been in there with our then ambassador and other government ministers. I have to say the conversations that we had were not of earth-shattering importance, because I don't think anyone in the government would ever have allowed me to be party to conversations of earth-shattering importance. However, it is a safe space. But you're more broadly right. I remember when I visited China as a government minister, I was told that I wasn't staying in the embassy, I was staying in a hotel, but I was told that to assume that everything that I said and did within that hotel room would be recorded, filmed, and observed. So I hope even now there are Chinese intelligence agencies trying to work out the policy of the British government on the basis of the fact that I was reading this Small House at Allington in my hotel room.
Well, Lily Dale is almost as perplexing as British foreign policy.
Precisely. I'm sure it is the case that when the Chinese intelligence agent said to his boss, "I have found a British minister with Trollope in his bedroom," that they would have thought, bingo.
We've got Harold Macmillan.
But talking of entrapment, after the break, we'll be discussing exactly how Nigel has advanced, Nigel Farage, that is, in his embrace of more defectors.
So in last week's podcast, we spoke about Nadeem Zahawi's defection to Reform UK. Since then, we've had two more defections. Robert Jenrick, the biggest name so far, and also Andrew Rosendale, who is perhaps less well known, but still a long-standing Conservative MP. We were in fact promised that there would also be some kind of Labour defection, though the announcement for that seems to have been postponed. It's pretty crazy how much, even in a single week, can change. Firstly, I wanted to ask you what your overall view was of the Jenrick defection, but also, can we expect probably more in the next few days? Is this this trickle turning into a flood?
Well, Nigel Farage had said that there's a cut-off date, that May the 7th, the day of the local elections, is the point at which the door is firmly closed. I think one should take that with a mild pinch of salt, in that if a truly big beast afterwards said that they wanted to defect, I don't think that Nigel Farage would turn his nose up at that. But it is the case that we're in a window now, because for anyone seeking to defect to reform on the basis that they think either that reform could save the country or that reform could save their careers, or both. The earlier adopters will almost by definition secure a greater degree of welcome from reform's leadership and its members. And indeed, Robert Jenrick was on Monday night in his constituency in Newark being hailed by the reform grassroots as, a very welcome new lieutenant in the reform camp. Both the defections that we've seen so far this week, both Robert Jenrick and Andrew Rossendale, have a distinctive flavour to them. So to discuss Andrew Rossendale first, he used as his justification his anger over what he considered to be relatively weak conservative opposition to the Chagos deal.
In the Lords, is he talking about?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was there when the Lords, in fact, I voted for a motion expressing regret at what was happening. I think it is Andrew's contention that the Conservatives should have tried to deploy what is called a fatal motion, which is when the House of Lords actually says that the Commons legislation can't go forward. This is very rare. It's the Lords' equivalent of the nuclear deterrent, and like the deployment of a nuclear missile, it may well invite the inevitable extinction of those launching it. And I think also Andrew's constituency, Romford, which is on the London-Essex borders, is one which is demographically sort of core reform.
Absolutely shoo-in, yes.
And again, Andrew's sort of ideological pedigree has been sort of nationalist Thatcherite. So it's not incongruous that Andrew should find himself in reform.
Yeah.
Now, Rob Jenrick, of course, has been the subject of a lot of speculation and commentary. And again, I should declare my interest, as it were, in that when I was a government minister, Rob was my PPS. When I ran for the leadership, of course, disastrously, in 2019, Rob was an enthusiastic and generous supporter of mine. And I personally like Rob and his wife, Michal. They're good company. And I think that Rob's decision, does make sense. I obviously recognise that it was done in a maladroit way, and that Kemi Badenoch's anticipation of it, her team's detective work, and her expulsion of it were the smack of firm government. But it's also my responsibility to take a couple of steps back. And while I've got respect for Rob and affection for Kemi, and indeed affection for Rob and respect for Kemi, nevertheless, one has to look at it in these terms. I think there's been a lot of commentary from people who are not necessarily false friends to Kemi, but who are offering, I think, slightly wonky advice, saying, well, now you got rid of Rob.
Yeah, let's have David Gauke back, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You should become...
Give David Gauke his birthright, yeah.
A one nation, born again sort of champion of my particular type of conservatism that hasn't been in fashion or the flavour of the moment. And I think that would be a mistake for Kemi, but even if I didn't think that, she clearly thinks it would be a mistake, given what she said to her colleagues.
But it's still could be a dangerous perception, and it certainly is one that is being propagated by reform supporters, including some ex-Tories who are now in the reform team. Our colleague Matthew Parris wrote a column in the Times which was basically arguing precisely this, and I bow to no one in my love of Matthew Parris and his writing, but I do think that was a spectacularly unhelpful intervention from him from the perspective of the Tory party, because now this is being presented as if it's actually their policy to go full Heseltine or whatever, but actually the centre desperately wants much lower migration. There's all sorts of positions on which the national centre is very different from where some of these wet type people imagine it to be, you know, and I don't want to slag these people off too much. Like, in many ways are very competent in other ways and had some real achievements, but I just think on this issue it's as you say, a false friend. It
is. And also what was considered to be the centre of British politics, whether accurately or not, 10 or 15 years ago, is no longer. You are right that the British public have consistently voted for lower migration. That's one of the reasons they voted Conservative in 2010, voted Leave in 2016, voted for Boris in 2019.
Gave David Cameron a majority.
Precisely.
In 2015.
And that hasn't been delivered. Most spectacularly, it hasn't been delivered, or wasn't delivered, post-2019. But if there were a sort of centrist view by which one means sort of reasonable establishment-ish view. Sensibilism. Then it would be, don't talk too much about this issue for fear of, stoking division. And besides, all of these people coming from abroad are absolutely vital for our delete as appropriate NHS, economy, future demographic health, etc. We now know that migration has not been the economic boon that the centrist establishment has considered it to be, and that there are other costs beyond the economic which it brings. The debate on that issue, like the debate on other issues, has shifted. And Rob Jenrick, in a way, is an exemplar of that, because earlier in his career, Rob, as a loyal conservative, was Cameroon-coded or Cameroon-coloured. Now, was he deep in his heart a one-nation conservative? I'm not sure, actually, given his background as a son of Wolverhampton, as someone who was, essentially brought up in a Thatchery, Powley background. I think it was because that was the mood of the party at the time that he went along with it. But whatever the truth of it...
he was also quite new in the party.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Exactly, a young man.
Yeah.
But whatever the truth of what he thought then, it is undoubtedly the case that the experience of being in the Home Office as the number 2 to Suella Braverman, as the Minister for Immigration, drove his frustration with the government's inability to deal with it, that is, our borders, and also radicalized him or strengthened his conviction that more required to be done. And now, it may well be that that strengthened conviction, that ideological hardening, is entirely consonant with his ambition then to lead the Conservatives and now to be a key player in a future administration. But there are very, very few politicians who don't have any ambition at all. If you are outlining how you think the country should be better or better protected, and you don't want to wield power or influence yourself, then it's open to you to be a Spectator contributor. But if you do, and you are an elected politician, then wanting to implement the policies in which you believe is not a sin.
Yeah. There's kind of two different things going on here. There are some, I think, once Kemi Badenoch had received the kind of intel or the whatever was left on top of the photocopier, delete as appropriate, she had no choice but to sack Jenrick. So why not do that straight away and look decisive, etc.? That was obviously the right thing to do. However, I think that should not be conflated with the longer term issue for the Conservative Party, which is that they have lost a strong Commons and media performer, someone who was good at taking the fight to the oppositions, who was good at campaigning on certain issues and kind of breaking through. And to be honest, I thought last week in what Jenrick was saying, the bit at the beginning sounded a bit more confected. Presume that was something that he had to kind of cobble together very quickly, because obviously he was bounced into having the press conference early, and some of it sounded quite insincere. But then when he began talking about dishing some home truths, once he'd finished slagging off Mel Stride and looking quite petty, he started talking about things that he had witnessed around the cabinet table. And that was where it really did start to ring painfully true for the Conservative Party. And it was really a lot of what he said at that point was basically impossible for anyone on the right to argue against.
Well, I think the challenge for Rob and for reform is the challenge that they also pose to the Conservative Party, which is what you're going to do about it. So I think that you are right that Rob Jenrick's account of the failure of some Conservatives to appreciate the scale and depth of what is required.
But he basically said almost all, apart from me and a couple of other people.
Yeah, well, I think that he was unfair on individuals, and I think that he was also wrong. I don't think he implied, but wrong perhaps to create the impression that Kemi Badenoch herself doesn't realise that there's a job of work to be done for the Conservative Party to get itself into a position where it both properly understands why it lost and properly has a prospectus for how the country can be improved. But my own feeling is that reform at the moment don't have that prospectus for how things should change. And if one were to look at what reform the Conservatives have said so far, both are committed to leaving the ECHR, both are committed to reforming indefinitely to remain to reduce the size of the Boris wave. Both have a clear analysis of some of the failures of the administrative state, but neither have yet put forward in detail what their prescription for improving things should be. And I'd argue, of course, unbiased, that there's been both a greater degree of detail from the Conservatives so far, particularly but not exclusively on the economy, and also if it comes to people who are both tough-minded and able to deliver, that if you look at the rising generation of Conservatives, Neil O'Brien, Nick Timothy, Katie Lamb, they have more to them than the reform team at the moment. Am I being sentimental and biased, do you think, Maddie?
Well, one thing I've noticed in the last few weeks is that Reform had been doing more to explain what their policies were. They were hosting press conferences in which they said, here's what our migration policy is going to be, and we'll take loads of questions from journalists and we will be really explicit. And now they seem to have almost like retrenched to a position which is actually, we can't do anything until we have completely destroyed and demolished and eaten the Conservative Party. That, I wonder if that partly comes from a place of slight insecurity, because the Conservatives, there had been a small, albeit from a very low position, let's not get ahead of ourselves if you're a Conservative listening to this, but there had been a slight bounce after the budget, in particular when Kemi Badenoch's response to Rachel Reeves did actually seem to have made an impact. And I noticed from then on that they then move more into let's bash the Tories. That to me suggests a certain fear that actually there's so much that is going to be mobilised against them, and they feel that this is going to be the most gloves off combat we've seen. Our opponents will do whatever they can to destroy us. They think that, you know, Keir Starmer would like to put them in jail. They may have a point with some of this stuff. I'm sure that the amount of lawfare, that, for example, that might be used against a reform government would be extreme. But I wonder if that's where this is coming from. But the problem is that now we're back to different factions on the right taking chunks out of each other. And the obvious beneficiary from that will be Keir Starmer.
Yes, I think that is true. And if both the Conservatives and Reform are so consumed with fear and loathing for each other, entirely understandable, it's a competitive system in our politics, that does mean that some of the heat is off Starmer. And you have this race in the run-up to the local elections and beyond to see which of them can secure ascendancy, what the pollsters call block dominance, because both know that if one is clearly ahead of the other, that by the time of the general election, that the smaller party is likely not to collapse completely, but to have so many of its supporters say, well, you know, I'd rather vote Tory or I'd rather vote Reform, but I want to get Keir Starmer out, and therefore I have no option but to, you know, vote for whoever is best placed to. Obviously, there's a core of Tories, current Tory voters and supporters, who would never vote Reform and vice versa.
Yes.
But there are a significant number of people who I'm sure by the time of the next election will say, by any means necessary, let's get Starmer out. The challenge will be if both parties are within hailing distance of each other by the time of the next election, and it's not entirely clear which of them would be best equipped both to eject Starmer and to form the government, that might allow Starmer, but probably more likely a sort of broad rainbow left alliance, to keep its hands on power. Yeah,
and actually, Reform, if they basically tacitly accept that, well, we want to eat and destroy the Conservative Party, but there are, as you say, there are some seats that are not going to vote Reform. Does that mean that there's basically a clear hand for, say, the Lib Dems to just take even more of the Southwest, for example, and other areas that have historically been kind of Lib Dem Tory marginals, of which there are many? And this partly explains why Ed Davey is asking such softball questions of Keir Starmer, because there are actually very few Labour Lib Dem marginals.
Yes.
So actually they have more to gain from their kind of grubby little unofficial alliance that's happening both in the Commons and the Lords, where the Lib Dems have pivoted to supporting government legislation
That
increasingly.
Undeniably the case.
Yeah.
And again, I think the Lib Dems are in a broad holding pattern at the moment, and they see some seats, some currently Conservative held seats, which they believe that they might win, and some that they fear they might lose to them. But they want to retain broadly a significant block of MPs in order to have what they hope might be a decisive influence on a future left or centre-left government. There has been some grumbling over the course of the last week, which obviously very few people have picked up because so much has been going on, about Ed Davey's leadership, about a lack of ambition or definition within that party. We might return to that, though I'm not sure that we should devote an entire episode of Quite Right to the Lib Dems, because we do have to have some respect for our listeners' sensitivities. I think that they may be in the position of an army that made an astonishing advance at the last election and is now seeking to hold the territory that it won, rather than with one or two daring raids, rather than make another land grab. But it is a difficult question for them overall. I think that the immediate reactions, which you quite rightly pointed out, the immediate shock, not amongst many people, but shock there was, that Rob had defected, and the immediate admiration for the dispatch with which Kemi had dealt with his manoeuvrings, has, I think you are right, given way to a broader reassessment that this makes the challenge overall, for the moment, of developing the most effective, viable and coherent alternative to Starmer more fraught. Not necessarily in the end imperiled, but certainly more fraught. And I think that means that the conversation amongst people who wish small c conservatives and small r right-wingers well, that conversation will be more intense and more intriguing in the weeks to come.
When I was watching Robert Jenrick at addressing the rally at Newark shortly after his defection, I was just looking in the audience, and I strongly suspect that a lot of people in that audience will have put their faith in Boris Johnson before. They were obviously massively let down. They're willing to put their faith in Reform UK. I don't think we're quite ready for the scale of democratic disenfranchisement and complete disillusion. Sorry, all these alliteration. If reform proves a failure as well, what happens next, having been let down so thoroughly by not one but two I mean, the refrain has been, the uniparty, it's all the same. But what if reform turns out to be the next head of the uniparty hydra, And if so many of the people entering the party are that feeling of sort of, not in the case of Jenrick, but maybe Zahawi, you can make a case that there's this sort of faint, like, morally dubious, tired ex-Tories. That really does undermine the claim to be a newcomer into the field of politics with something new and fresh to offer.
One of the things that you touched on last week, which I think is true, Reform's critique of the Conservative failure obviously contains many strands. But the most salient examples of that, migration rising, taxes increasing, were consequences of decisions taken post-2019 and post-COVID, when Boris was Prime Minister. Now, I was in the government. I could enter a defence of some of those decisions. I shan't now, because I also would want to not only moderate that defence, but in some cases join the critics. But put that to one side. It is undoubtedly the case that is true. But as has been oft remarked, and as you pointed out last week, many, though not Rob Jenrick, of the defectors from the Tory to reform are Borisites. So many of those who are most ardent for Boris and retain the deepest affection for him still are the people who defected to reform in order to endorse a critique of the man himself, the government he led, and the measures they supported. So there's an element of irrationality, you can argue about that, but there is also an emotional coherence to it, in that the reason I imagine many of them supported Boris is that what they wanted was the disruptor who would not be trammelled by the establishment. Yeah. And that is what they see in Nigel. And I think that in Rob Jenrick's case, he has, having grown up as someone who was at a distance from the establishment, and then having joined it, he's now bent on overturning it. And so there is, again, an emotional logic to where he is now. Will it go well for him? Will it go well for reform? We will see.